Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. This is our November 11th, 2021 legislative update, and we have some exciting things to talk about. But first, recognize today is Veterans Day. We thank all of the folks that have served in the armed forces in the United States, protecting us and our freedoms, but especially the IEEE members that have played a role in our national defense and service in our various armed forces. Today is, of course, the 11th day of the 11th month, commemorating the last day of World War I, and we extend our thanks and gratitude to all those who have served. Speaking of service, we wanted to note the passing of Max Cleland. Max Cleland was an Army veteran, winner of the Silver and Bronze Star for his service in Vietnam, where he lost 3 of his limbs. He went on to serve as a state senator from Georgia here in Washington from 1996 to 2002. He was Secretary of the Veterans Administration, Director of the Export-Import Bank, and generally an all-around useful American serving his country in all sorts of capacities. He left the Senate shortly before I came to IEEE, but in previous jobs I had worked with him and his staff, and I remember his staff as being, generally the rule is legislative staff take on the personality of their boss. And Max Cleland's staff was always one of those staffs that focused on the details. It wasn't enough to get the clause right or get the general position right. They were very focused on making sure the policy was designed correctly. And I admired that in the senator and certainly appreciated that when I was working with him. Big news from the last 2 weeks was the election last Tuesday. New Jersey, Virginia had state elections, and then there was a smattering of elections in other places all across the country, and the general news out of that election was Republicans did very, very well. Republicans swept the state races in Virginia for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, secured the control of the state house by picking up 7 legislative districts in the state. Republicans also almost won the governor of New Jersey race, the race which was not supposed to be close, and had a surprise win in a bunch of local races. That includes attorney general race in Seattle, a number of county attorney general races in Long Island, among other places. A novice politician, Edward Durr, has taken out the Senate president in New Jersey, the second most powerful political leader in New Jersey after the governor himself. Mr. Durr spent apparently $2,000, give or take, on his campaign to unseat Steve Sweeney, longtime Senate president. And I always enjoy those kind of races where somebody, a non-professional rookie, throws together a race, just goes out and talks to people and still ends up winning. I think it's good for the country when that happens every now and then and keeps all the other politicians on their toes. Democrats did win a state house race in Maine, so all was not lost, but overall the Republicans had a very good day. The result was not particularly unusual. The president's party, that is, usually loses seats in the election immediately after they take over the White House. But the size of the win and the scope of the win was surprising. Republicans, as I mentioned, won seats all over the place, including bright blue places like Seattle and New York, as well as Virginia, which is interesting and noteworthy. So the question then is, what does it mean? Pundits, consultants, reporters always argue and always view these elections in terms of the national politics. The assumption is that Virginia did what it did, New Jersey did what it did because of national events and things that are happening in Washington. And this is almost never true. Elections are won and lost at the local level. Glenn Youngkin, the new governor-elect of Virginia, won because of some very specific developments in Virginia and because of the specific campaign tactics that he adopted. But that's not what legislators think. The prevailing wisdom here in Washington is that the election last Tuesday indicates that Republicans will probably have a very good election next year, that there's a national trend against the Democrats and in favor of the Republicans. And at the end of the day, that actually means a lot more than what actually happened. From our perspective, first of all, IEEE-USA doesn't care who won the election. We take no position on that, and we work well with pretty much anybody the American public sees fit to send to Washington. So we don't care. But we do care what legislators think happened last Tuesday. And the reason for that is simply that what they think happened will change their behavior over the next year. Politicians will respond to what they think happened when they vote and in terms of what they do. And so their perception of what happened matters a great deal more to us than what actually happened. And as I mentioned, most politicians in Washington have concluded that what happened on November 2nd was a repudiation of the Democratic Party and an indication, a strong indication, that the Democrats are going to have a bad day, election day of 2022. Now, what does this mean? Well, it intensifies the fight between moderates and liberals within the Democratic Party. Put more generally, this always happens when a party loses an election, right? Moderates in the party say they lost because the party lost the independence, that the party needs to do things to recapture the middle ground. We need to soften our rhetoric, kind of abandon some of our extreme positions and move to the middle. Whereas the true believers, liberals in this case, Tea Party Republicans a couple years ago, argue that the problem with the election was not that they moved too far to one direction, it's that they didn't move far enough. That they need to stay true to their principles, they need to prove that they stand for something, and that the electorate wants to see them doing what they promised they would do. No idea which one is right, but what I do know is that there was already conflict between the two wings of the Democratic Party, and that's likely to get much, much worse. In addition, party discipline will start to break down within the Democratic Party. As individual legislators start to realize or come to believe that they are going to have to run a perfect campaign next year to continue to be members of Congress, they will be far less interested in taking a tough vote to help the party or listening to party leadership. Compounding that, I suspect, will be an increase in retirements from the Democratic Party. The Democratic leadership at the moment is very old. Most of the senior leaders of the Democratic Party are in their late 70s or 80s. There's a growing belief that most of them will not be here next year, either because they will retire or simply be replaced. For example, most people around D.C. think Nancy Pelosi is in her last year as Speaker. They don't think she'll actually serve next year. Now, she may run for re-election and then resign after the election. But most people don't think she's going to be around much longer. Well, once you're a short-termer, your clout starts to disappear very quickly. And as more Democrats probably announce their retirement, it probably won't happen in large number until after they finish this year's session. So the end of December and then January and February, where we'll see a lot of those retirements. That weakens the structure of the Democratic Party. It makes it harder for them to push things through. Republicans, on the other hand, have all of the opposite things happening. The moderates and the right-wing Republicans can get along because they're all fighting for the same thing, which is to win. Party discipline is very easy. Party discipline is easier when you're in the minority anyway, because you're all just united in opposition. Although we saw an exception from that this week. And it would be unusual to see too many retirements. Why would you retire now when you're in the minority when you get to run the place next year? Maybe. And so that's the basic dynamic, all of which will make it very hard to get big things done. Speaking of big things, we had some actual movement, some significant movement on the infrastructure and reconciliation bills. Going back to our last update, I talked a great deal about a framework agreement that Democrats had reached amongst themselves for the basic structure of what the reconciliation bill will look like. That was not true. There was kind of a vague agreement on what the structure might eventually be negotiated as, but there was no real agreement. And we've since seen discussions over the reconciliation bill break down. In light of that, last week, Nancy Pelosi simply decided to bring the infrastructure bill up for a vote, and it did in fact pass the House. It was the Senate version of the bill that passed the House, meaning it's done. President Biden, as we all knew he would sign it, that signing ceremony will likely happen on Monday, and then it will be done. The reconciliation bill is going to be voted on in the House sometime probably this month. But there will likely not be an agreement with the Senate before that happens. So in other words, the House will vote on whatever it is it wants to do. What it wants to do will be unacceptable to the Senate. The Senate has then the option of passing a different bill, which can then be conferenced or just dropping the whole thing. Either way, the fact that they can't come to an agreement in advance does bode poorly for the eventual passage of the reconciliation bill. With infrastructure done, it is likely that moderates, the folks that are in danger of losing next year in particular, are going to walk away from the bill and try to focus on other things that are more likely to boost their standing in their district. So, like I said, the infrastructure bill is exactly what the Senate passed. And so we talked about what was in the Senate bill several weeks ago. If you're interested, email me. I can give you the details. But we have the broadband deployment and broadband infrastructure money, money for improvements to the electric grid, particularly to build resilience into the grid, surprising support for the nuclear energy industry, which we haven't seen in quite a long time, money for state and local governments to help them with cybersecurity. Cryptocurrency rules are still in there. We'll come back to that in just a second. There are some CHIPS Act provisions in the infrastructure bill, not the bulk of the bill, but there is some language in there that if Congress can't manage to pass the CHIPS Act in totality, there is some language in the infrastructure bill that should allow some pieces of it to be put in place. Lastly, there is no immigration provisions in the infrastructure bill. There are actually some fairly minor things dealing with national security waivers for immigrants, but nothing that we care about. There were a few press reports about major visa reform in the bill. That is not the case. So, like I said, let's not go to that just yet. The cryptocurrency rules are still in the bill. Now, you may recall very late in the process, rules on transparency and regulations on cryptocurrency brokers was tucked into the Senate version of the bill. Kind of last minute, didn't get vetted very well, and there was great concern raised by the cryptocurrency community over those rules. Some folks actually said if they were enforced in certain ways, they could shut down the crypto business in the United States. The expectation was those provisions would be stripped out of the bill in the House and then left out of the bill during conference. But they never went to conference. And this is one of the problems with, governing quickly. The provisions which most people recognized at the very least needed to be reformed, if not completely eliminated, are now law. Now, the Treasury Department has said they are going to enforce the new rules with a great deal of flexibility so that the worst case scenario will not happen. We'll see how that goes. There are already court cases being prepared to go after those rules. But this is actually a big deal and could be a problem down the line. Also point out there was an expectation that Chuck Schumer would insert more of the CHIPS Act into the infrastructure bill during conference. And the House was working on some provisions similar to the CHIPS Act that they could put in their infrastructure bill. That is not going to happen. There's not going to be another chance to edit this bill before President Biden signs it, and so we lost that opportunity as well. Still a good bill, still a lot of good stuff in there. Note on the Senate appropriations process, the House has passed all of its appropriations bills, so we're just looking at the Senate at this point, and they are way behind and really haven't made much progress recently at all. Like I said, the House has passed all their bills. The Senate has passed none of them. 3 of the appropriations bills have passed Senate committee. which will have some relevance as the Senate moves on to its inevitable churn to focus on the omnibus bill, which will be passed in December. In other words, the formal appropriations process has basically run its course for the year, and we're now looking at an omnibus bill which will just wrap a bunch, if not all, of the appropriations bills into one piece of legislation, which we expect shortly after Thanksgiving. Which brings us to the legislative crunch that we... Oops. Oh, my keyboard there. Sorry about that. That we all see coming. There are 3 weeks in the 2021 legislative calendar. Now, there are 2 weeks, well, 1.5 weeks after that can be used for legislative business before we get to Christmas. But they're trying to get out 3 weeks from now, and that's not going to happen. Before they go home at the end of the year, Congress has to pass the appropriations, fiscal 2022 appropriations bills. Like I said, they're not going very well. They have to fix the debt ceiling. Technically, they might be able to let that slide to January, but they really need to be at least very close to getting it passed in December, or it's going to wreak havoc on the financial markets, global financial markets, and they really probably need to pass it. The NDAA needs to pass, National Defense Authorization Act needs to get done, and then there's the reconciliation bill itself. Now, the word on the street is reconciliation has to pass this year if it's going to pass. I don't think that's technically true. I think that the Democrats could still pass this in December or maybe even February if they can't get it done this year. But they probably can't get it passed in April. By that point, we'll be getting too close to the election. Too many other things will be going on. And if they haven't gotten it done by then, they probably won't get it done at all. And so they don't really have to pass reconciliation this year. But what they do have to do is stop talking about it. In order to get these other very large legislative priorities done, they're going to have to focus on them and spend some time on them. And at the moment, the reconciliation bill is still sucking up most of the leadership's attention. That's going to make it hard to get the debt ceiling done. It's going to make it hard to get the omnibus bill done. NDAA might be a little bit different, more on that in a second. And so if they're not going to get reconciliation done, if they can't come to an agreement on it, and frankly, they're not particularly close to coming to an agreement on the reconciliation bill, and if that is the case next week, they probably need to just drop it until January. You could work on it behind the scenes over the holidays, but they're going to need to shift gears and focus on these other bills if they're going to get them done in time. Speaking of the NDAA, it is actually moving along rather nicely. It's passed the House. It's moving along in the Senate. But it does have a complicated path to follow. Just to walk you through this, the House has passed it. The Senate still needs to pass its version of the NDAA. The two versions have to be conferenced, and then it has to go back to the House and the Senate for another vote, and then the president has to sign it. That is going to require a certain amount of time. So even though it's moving along quite nicely, it's not attracting the controversial provisions that we saw last year, in part because reconciliation is still alive. It's still going to take a couple weeks to get this done, even without controversy. And as I just noted, they only have a couple weeks. And so I think the NDAA is benefiting from the fact that nobody's paying attention to it. So that not much is being attached to it. And so it does have a fairly easy path to passage. But that path is going to take some time. It's going to take floor time. It's going to take leadership time. And they don't have an awful lot of that left. One win to note, an IEEE-sponsored provision has been added to the NDAA, providing funding for small businesses to participate in standards development activities. This is part of an effort that IEEE-USA is involved in to strengthen the standards process in the United States, to increase participation in it by American companies, particularly smaller companies that generally can't afford to do this sort of thing, and also to increase participation by the U.S. government. And so this is in the NDAA. It is not controversial. It has bipartisan support. Not many people are aware of it, but that's okay. And so it is likely that it will survive into the final version. Interestingly, this provision was actually drafted by the Senate but it was put into the House version of the NDAA, which is weird but good because now both chambers are on record supporting it. A couple notes on cryptocurrency policy, and this is an interesting area that we are focusing on more here at IEEE-USA. We don't have a position on it, but we're thinking about it. The European Union has been doing a lot of work on cryptocurrency, and there were comments out earlier this week from legislators in the EU about how they are viewing cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency regulation. According to them, the governments of Europe and more broadly the governments of the entire world, I think, are still trying to navigate the technology. They're still trying to figure it out. But the emerging consensus is that cryptocurrency needs regulation and legislation to control it and put some boundaries on it, but not prohibitions. The prevailing wisdom is that these things are good, but difficult. And that's a change from where we were a couple years ago when a lot of legislators thought cryptocurrency were bad. They were just empowering criminals and they needed to be banned. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. There is also agreement that current laws simply won't work as regulation for cryptocurrency. In other words, you can't take existing banking law and just kind of cram cryptocurrency into it. It just doesn't work. Cryptocurrency is different. It needs different rules and different regulations, which is probably true. And legislators need to start focusing on that. EU also explicitly called for new reliability standards for cryptocurrency to make sure that they are being developed and they are being managed appropriately, which is something, by the way, IEEE could do, which would be kind of cool. The European Union is moving faster on this than the United States is. The EU is currently looking at ways to use distributed ledger technology to make state finances more transparent and more accessible. So it's easier to tell what your government is actually spending money on, which would be very cool. They are working on basic market regulations. Again, those fundamental rules on cryptocurrency, things like no insider trading. Can't use them to launder money. You can't hide them. Basic rules that exist in the banking system, but which those rules in the banking system don't translate to cryptocurrency particularly well. So we need new rules to do essentially the same thing. We need new anti-crime rules on ransomware and stealing things, and basic rules protecting cryptocurrency. Interestingly, the EU, the legislators that were speaking this week, made a point of saying their efforts on cryptocurrency are not part of an anti-US push. But they probably are. There is a belief, well, it's not a belief, there's a feeling in Europe, let me phrase that, there's a recognition in Europe that most of the world's big tech companies are in the United States, some of them in Asia, none of them in Europe, or almost none of them in Europe. And that bothers legislators in Europe. And so a lot of what they do on technology policy is colored by this kind of undertone of a desire to create space in the global technology economy for European companies to emerge. And so while that's not the driving force behind their crypto policy, I do think it's there. It's part of it. That they want to find a way to make Europe and European companies players in the cryptocurrency space, in part because they're irritated that so many American companies are, and Chinese, and a few other countries, India. But so that's there, if only in the background. It's also interesting to note that there are experiments going on in a number of countries, particularly the Philippines, El Salvador, and the Bahamas, on the government's use of cryptocurrency. Philippines and El Salvador are in some ways particularly interesting because both countries are trying to use cryptocurrency to overcome limitations in their society. Both are kind of low trust societies. They both have corruption problems. They're trying to use the inherent transparentness of cryptocurrency to overcome some of their legacy problems. This is in some ways what a number of countries did with cell phones several years ago, where rather than trying to maintain a system of hardline telephones, you have to string up all the wires and all the poles and all that. Instead of doing that, they just built a cell phone network and told people to get a cell phone, which worked in many parts of the third world. And those systems are easier to build, they're easier to maintain, and they work better. Cryptocurrency might allow countries to build systems that overcome some of the problems in society fairly cheaply. So we'll keep an eye on the Philippines, El Salvador, the Bahamas, and others to see how they go. Lastly, I just wanted to bring your attention to a very cool video that the IEEE Foundation put out last week. There's a link there, but if you just Google IEEE Foundation Estate Planning, you'll find it much more quickly. Looking at changes in the financial rules surrounding estate planning, retirement planning, not anything that IEEE-USA really follows, and it's not anything I'm an expert in, but they have some really big name experts on this particular session, and so if you're interested, I encourage you to check them out. Also wanted to bring your attention to 3 IEEE volunteer funds that are active as we approach the end of the year. The IEEE-USA Fund is used, and the general fund is used to fund special projects within IEEE-USA. The IEEE-USA Move Fund helps defray the cost of the move trucks, our disaster relief work that we do around the country. And our new IEEE-USA Student Public Policy Fund is used to underwrite our IEEE WISE Fellows programs that brings undergraduate students into Washington, D.C., fingers crossed, next year. There's a match program going on in the Student Public Policy Fund, by the way. A very generous donor has agreed to match any donations that fund receives up to, I believe, $10,000 throughout the rest of the year, I think. So things to check out. The video is excellent, and if you're curious about this sort of stuff, I encourage you to watch it. Our next update will be December 2nd. It will not be in 2 weeks, but rather 3 weeks. 2 weeks from now is Thanksgiving, and I'm just going to guess that none of you want to listen to me talk about politics on Thanksgiving afternoon, so we're just going to push it off to the next week. By December 2nd, we will need to have a pretty clear idea of how Congress intends to finish up its work for the year. Technically, they only have a couple days after that to finish, although they really have about a week and a half, but that's not a lot of time. And so by December 2nd, we should have a pretty clear idea of how the debt ceiling is going to get raised, how the appropriations bills were going to get passed, and what's going on with reconciliation. And if we don't, we know Congress is going to have a really rough Christmas. As always, if you have questions or concerns, you feel free to put them into your chat box, which we'll turn to in a second. And while you're doing that, I am Russ Harrison, the Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. My phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. Feel free to reach out anytime. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and go to comments. Okay. Jay, good to hear from you. Asking about the NDAA cybersecurity provisions. A general comment on the NDAA is that it's still a fairly clean bill. It focuses on a lot of defense policy work, which we are not that concerned about. There is the cybersecurity model in there, which I have not read in detail yet. I still need to do that. It's important, but it's mostly a defense thing, as I understand it. The little that I've looked at it, it's mostly focused on defense cybersecurity, which is important and critical and something that we care about. But we're spending more time on kind of broader societal cybersecurity protections, which the NDAA will only do so much about. So it's worth noting, and if today's producer Corey can remind me after we're done, I will make a note of that to talk about a little more detail next time. Yolanda, very good question. Does the infrastructure bill need to go through appropriations? And the answer is no. It is kind of an extra appropriation bill. It is beyond the appropriation structure. And so most of those funds will be appropriated regardless of what the appropriations people do. That's something that Congress has started doing in the last couple years. I'm not entirely sure it's wise. But that is what they're doing. Now, what can happen is the appropriations bill can override the infrastructure bill. In other words, next year, Congress could vote to not spend the money that they voted to spend this year. And so the infrastructure bill, future appropriations bills could undo what's being done, but they don't have to take any affirmative action to make them happen at this point. Build Back Better is the reconciliation bill. Because that bill goes by a bunch of different names depending on whatever the talking points of the day are, I use the term reconciliation to always refer to it just to keep it simple. But that's what Build Back Better is. That is the big, used to be $3.5 trillion, now is like $1.7 trillion, maybe it could be more than that depending on how you count. And that bill's, it's kind of a mess. There are some very huge provisions of the bill that the Democrats cannot agree on. There are parts of it they can agree on, but they can't agree if they just want to move those or if they want to hold off to do everything at once. There was a big debate yesterday, for example, on the tax provisions in the bill. Remember, the president said the entire bill will be paid for, which it won't, but the Democrats can't decide how they're going to do it. There are a lot of proposals to do some fairly major tax increases, but there's no agreement on what those are going to be. It looks like at one point there was going to be a surtax added to the income tax of any American that made over, I think it was $2 million. That's been ditched, so now they're talking about a larger surcharge on Americans who make more than $10 million a year. It's not clear that's going to raise enough money. It's also not clear if that's going to have the votes. So there's actually a lot of work that needs to be done on that bill before we have, an actual bill to talk about. So I think they're still pretty far away in getting that done, which is why I think there's an increasing chance it's going to move to next year, if ever. Ed, I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to there. 10 times increase in OSHA fines, with the highest being $700,000. I believe that is referencing the Build Back Better bill. If I recall correctly, that is one of the revenue generators in that bill. We do not have a position on OSHA fines. Just to remind everyone, as your representative, as one of your representatives in Washington, I cannot take positions on bills just because I think it's a good idea. There's a process IEEE-USA has. It involves actually a couple hundred IEEE members to make sure that before we talk on a bill, the broader membership has agreed that, yes, this is something that we want. We do not have a position on OSHA or OSHA fines. We've had positions on OSHA in the past, but don't currently. And Ed, if you want to talk about that in more detail, feel free to give me a call. As I mentioned when answering Yolanda's question, however, that the bill is in such flux at this point that it's really hard to talk about specific provisions that are in the bill because they're in there today, but they might not be in there tomorrow. And if there are specific pieces of that provision that you are particularly concerned about, give me a call and we can talk about it. Yeah, I get exactly what you're saying there. A $700,000 fine on a small business is a big deal. And OSHA enforcement has never been easy. It's one of those agencies that everybody hates because nobody really wants it to do its job, but everybody really wants it to do its job. So I think that's something we might want to take a look at to make sure that whatever they end up doing isn't that punitive. Okay, I'm just flipping through my screener. I don't see any other questions. All right. So thank you guys for joining us today. Thank you for joining me today. It's always great to talk with you. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Have a wonderful Veterans Day. And I hope all of your falls are going well. And we'll talk to you again in early December as we approach the end game for 2021. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Russ Harrison.
I am trying to build a sustainable electronics industry. The things that we have just don't last as long as they used to, but they could. Every time a new gizmo comes out, we take it apart, find out what makes it tick. We need more engineers in the world. Engineers make the world better. They are designing the systems that keep the world working. So that's why I've been involved with IEEE-USA, is I want to see more kids get excited about engineering. We are working with IEEE-USA to create a world where repair is normal again.